$12.5 billion. That was the mistake that broke Tim Hortons. In 2014, a Brazilian investment firm paid that price to buy Canada's coffee icon. Within 2 years, they had destroyed it. 70% market share became 50%. Fresh donuts became frozen garbage. The smell of baking disappeared from every store. Tim Hortons died twice, once in the early 2000s when they killed fresh baking, and again in 2014 when 3G Capital finished it off. Let's walk through the wreckage. 1964, Hamilton, Ontario. Tim Horton, a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs, opened a donut shop on Ottawa Street. Just coffee and donuts, 10 cents each. Simple. Tim was built like a truck. At 6'1" and 200 pounds, he was known as the strongest man in hockey. Bobby Hull once said you didn't fear Tim Horton because he was vicious. You respected him because he didn't need to be. His strength alone kept you in check. But Tim knew hockey money wouldn't last forever, so he bet on donuts. The business grew slowly at first. Then in 1965, a former Hamilton police officer named Ron Joyce bought the first franchise. 2 years later, Joyce and Horton became full partners. The formula was simple. Every morning at 4 a.m., bakers arrived to make donuts from scratch. They mixed the dough, rolled it, cut it, fried it in oil. The smell of fresh baking traveled down city blocks. You could smell Tim Hortons before you saw it. Inside, the stores felt like a living room. Warm yellow lighting, wooden booths, regulars who knew each other by name. Truck drivers sat next to teachers, sat next to office workers. Everyone got the same great coffee. This was the third place, not home, not work, somewhere in between. In 1976, they invented Timbits, little donut holes sold in boxes of 10 or 20. Kids loved them. Parents loved them. They became a cultural icon. In 1986, they launched Roll Up the Rim to Win, a spring promotion where you peeled back the rim of your coffee cup to see if you won a prize. It became a national obsession. Co-workers competed, families kept score. Tim Hortons wasn't just selling coffee anymore, it was creating memories. By the early 90s, the term double-double had entered the Canadian vocabulary. 2 creams, 2 sugars. In 2004, it was added to the Canadian Oxford Dictionary. A coffee order had become part of the national identity. But behind the scenes, corporate was running the numbers. Fresh baking was expensive, labor costs were high, waste was significant, profit margins were thin. Then Wendy's came calling. In 1995, Wendy's International bought Tim Hortons for approximately $425 million. Ron Joyce stayed on to run the business. For a while, nothing changed. The donuts were still fresh, the coffee was still great, the stores still felt like home. But Wendy's executives had other plans. 2003, Tim Hortons had reached the peak, more than 3,000 locations across Canada, 70% of the hot brewed coffee market. Customers were loyal, franchisees were profitable, the brand was untouchable. Then Wendy's corporate called a meeting. They presented what they called an operational efficiency initiative. The choice was simple: keep fresh baking and accept lower margins, or switch to par baking and increase profits by 30%. Par baking meant donuts would be partially baked in a factory, flash frozen, shipped in trucks, and reheated in stores using microwaves and convection ovens. Tim Hortons chose profit. Here is the science of what happened. When you freeze baked goods and reheat them, the starch molecules undergo something called retrogradation. They crystallize faster than fresh dough. The texture becomes gummy within 30 minutes. Then it turns to cardboard. Fresh frying creates pleasant aroma compounds. Caramelizing sugar, browning butter, yeast doing its work. Reheating frozen dough creates a different smell. Yeasty, chemical, wrong. Tim Hortons' new customers would notice, so they installed powerful HVAC systems and air curtains at store entrances. The goal was to neutralize the smell, to hide what they had done. The 4 a.m. bakers were fired, replaced with reheating technicians who followed timer instructions. The "Always Fresh" slogan stayed on the signs, but it had become a legal loophole. The donuts were always freshly reheated. Technically true, completely dishonest. Customers noticed immediately, but brand loyalty held for a while. The smell died first, then the taste, then the trust. For 3 years, the frozen donut stayed mostly quiet. Quality had collapsed, but profits were up. Franchisees were happy. Corporate was happy. Then came the predators. In 2014, Burger King and the Brazilian investment firm 3G Capital made an offer, 12.5 billion Canadian dollars, the largest restaurant acquisition in Canadian history. 3G Capital had a reputation. When they bought Heinz, they eliminated 5,000 jobs immediately. When they took over Budweiser, they gutted middle management and slashed costs to the bone. Everyone knew what was coming. The deal closed in December 2014. Restaurant Brands International was born. Tim Hortons, Burger King, and later Popeyes all came under one corporate umbrella. The cost-cutting began within months. First, they switched coffee suppliers. For decades, Tim Hortons had worked with Mother Parker's Tea and Coffee, a Canadian company. When Tim Hortons moved roasting in-house around 2009, Mother Parker's began supplying McDonald's Canada instead. The two chains used different blends, but the irony was perfect. McDonald's launched McCafe using a premium supplier, while Tim Hortons switched to cheaper beans. Canadians noticed. The coffee tasted thinner, weaker, wrong. McDonald's ran ads that did not mention Tim Hortons by name. They did not need to. Everyone understood. Then came the menu explosion. Breakfast sandwiches, lunch wraps, loaded bowls, flatbread pizza at a donut shop. The company had forgotten what it was. Here's what happens when you add 40 items to a menu that used to have 10. The worker behind the counter is operating a coffee machine, a microwave, a panini press, a blender, and a convection oven simultaneously for $14 an hour. Cognitive load increases, speed drops, mistakes multiply, the core products suffer. This is called the 20-second death spiral. Every additional menu item adds complexity. Complexity reduces execution quality. Quality decline drives customers away. Revenue drops. Corporate adds more items to compensate. The spiral continues. The third place was dying too. Stores were redesigned. Out went the wooden booths and warm yellow lighting. In came hard plastic chairs, cold blue fluorescent lights, and sterile white walls. Many regulars felt the atmosphere had shifted from welcoming to institutional. Electrical outlets were removed in many locations. The message was clear: buy your coffee and leave. This was not an accident. This was anti-loitering design, making the space uncomfortable enough that people do not stay. The community living room became a transaction terminal. Then came January 2018. Ontario raised the minimum wage from $11.60 to $14 per hour, a 20% increase overnight. Restaurant Brands International refused to let franchises raise menu prices to cover the cost. McDonald's raised prices. Starbucks raised prices. Every other chain raised prices. Tim Hortons said no. Franchise owners were trapped. Labor costs had spiked and corporate would not allow price increases. Something had to give. At a Cobourg, Ontario location owned by Ron Joyce Jr. and Jerilyn Horton Joyce, the son of the co-founder and the daughter of Tim Horton himself, employees received a letter. Paid breaks were eliminated. Workers on 9-hour shifts would now be paid for 8 hours and 20 minutes. Health and dental benefits were cut. Employees had to pay 50 to 75% of premiums that were previously free. Free uniforms were eliminated. Workers were charged $90 to $100 per year. Free coffee at the end of shifts was eliminated. One worker calculated she lost $51 per paycheck despite the wage increase. The backlash was immediate. The hashtag Boycott Tim Hortons trended nationally. 15 protests erupted across Ontario on January 10th. Premier Kathleen Wynne called it the act of a bully. Corporate called the franchise owners rogue and reckless. Critics pointed out that RBI itself had created the situation by refusing to allow the price increases that every other chain implemented. The damage was done. In the 2018 Ledger Corporate Reputation Study, Tim Hortons collapsed from 4th place to 50th place in 1 year. The company lost 25 percentage points. Analysts called it unprecedented. The Reputation Institute study showed Tim Hortons falling from 13th to 67th when measured against all companies operating in Canada. Tim Hortons now ranked below competitors it had dominated for decades, below McDonald's, below Starbucks, below brands that had barely existed in Canada 10 years earlier. Market share in the broader caffeinated beverage category fell from 75% to 53% between 2014 and 2021. McDonald's and Starbucks took what Tim Hortons lost. The Great White North Franchisee Association, representing half of Canadian franchise owners, went public. They accused corporate of profiting while stores lost money. They demanded changes. Corporate ignored them. Same-store sales turned negative. Employee turnover spiked. Social media filled with horror stories. Every day, another viral post about terrible service or inedible food. Tim Hortons tried to fix it. Every attempt failed. They launched nostalgia campaigns showing the always fresh slogan, but the products were still frozen. They promised to get back to basics. Nothing changed. They introduced Tim Rewards, a loyalty program designed to win back customers. You cannot bribe your way to quality. They digitized Roll Up the Rim, moving the beloved promotion to an app. Canadians hated it. The physical cups were part of the tradition. The ritual mattered. They tried premium positioning, raised prices while quality stayed terrible. Customers revolted. Today, Tim Hortons sits at the bottom of customer satisfaction surveys. The brand that defined Canadian identity is now foreign-owned and locally despised. The stores still do not smell like bakeries. The HVAC systems installed in 2003 are still running, neutralizing the evidence. The hard plastic chairs remain. The third place is gone. The community living room is a memory. Restaurant Brands International continues to extract profits. But the foundation is crumbling. Negative same-store sales, massive employee turnover, franchisees in revolt. A generation of Canadians who grew up on Tim Hortons now drinks McDonald's coffee instead. The company uses maple leafs and hockey imagery in every ad, but it is owned by a foreign conglomerate that refuses to invest in the quality that made the brand worth buying in the first place. The scent died first, then the taste, then the trust, then the brand. $12.5 billion bought an icon. Private equity destroyed it. They killed fresh baking, switched to cheaper coffee, eliminated the smell, engineered out the warmth, forgot they were a coffee shop, started selling flatbread pizza. You cannot microwave authenticity. You cannot cost-cut your way to quality. You cannot betray what made you special and expect customers not to notice. When you do, they find someone who won't.